Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a truly pivotal moment in ancient history, focusing on a single figure who became this potent symbol of resistance against the rising tide of Roman power.
Yeah, we've been digging into the material on Vercingetorix. He was, the Gallic chieftain who actually managed to unite a whole bunch of tribes and take on Julius Caesar himself. This was during the really final brutal years of the Gallic Wars.
Right. And our goal here is to really unpack his story, where he came from, his struggle, his tactics.
And ultimately his legacy, which is, well, pretty complex.
Absolutely. And this isn't just, dry history. It's about understanding the forces at play, the kind of impossible odds he faced, and actually some surprising ways his story still echoes today.
It really is. We'll see how he tried to forge unity where, frankly, only division had existed before.
And what that tells us about leadership, I suppose, and resistance against, well, overwhelming power.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. We're talking mid-1st century BC in Gaul. For years now, Rome, under Caesar, has been pushing steadily beyond its established province.
Gallia Narbonensis, right. They're conquering tribes, extending their influence. But how were they so successful? The material makes it pretty clear.
Oh yeah, Caesar was a master of divide and rule. That's the key. He actively exploited all the existing rivalries and the factionalism among the Gallic elites.
He'd play favorites, wouldn't he? Offer political support, even Roman luxuries like wine to certain nobles just to keep them divided or get them on his side against rivals.
Exactly. And previous attempts at revolt, they were always just local flare-ups. Easy for Rome to squash one by one because Gaul just wasn't unified.
It wasn't a single nation, just a collection of tribes often fighting each other.
Which was Rome's biggest advantage. Now, into this complicated mixed steps, Vercingetorix. The texts identify him as an Arverni nobleman. That's one of the most powerful tribes in central Gaul.
And his father, Celtillus, he'd actually tried to rule all of Gaul himself.
He did. And he was executed for it. By his own countrymen, importantly. They saw it as trying to become a king, which went against their traditions.
Wow. So Vercingetorix grows up knowing just how dangerous that kind of ambition is, maybe even seeing it as impossible?
You'd think so. But then there's his name, Vercingetorix. It feels almost, well, destined.
It's not really a personal name like we think of it, is it? More like a title.
Precisely. Translated from Gaulish, it's something like Great King of Warriors or Supreme Warrior Leader. Vers is over, or superior. Singeta was warrior as Erix is king.
And didn't one of the Romans, Florus, say it sounded like a name meant to inspire terror?
He did. A name that really embodies power and leadership.
So despite his father's fate, despite all the divisions, he starts to make a move. How does this big revolt actually start?
Timing was everything. It really kicks off in early 52 BC. And crucially, Caesar's actually away. He's in Italy raising more troops.
Okay. An opportunity.
Definitely. Some northern tribes, the Carnutes, they start things off by attacking Roman settlers. This acts like a spark, igniting a wider rebellion. And Vercingetorix, back in his homeland with the Arverni, he seizes the moment.
But hang on, even among his own people, the Arverni, he wasn't immediately welcomed as a leader.
Not at all. He tries to rally support in the main Arvernian town, Gergovia, urging them to join the fight. But the established nobles, including his own uncle, Gobernitio, they thought it was madness, way too risky.
So they kicked him out. The guy who becomes the symbol of Gallic unity gets thrown out by his own tribe's leadership initially.
That's right. They expelled him and his followers. They preferred, trying to get along with Rome rather than risking open war.
That's incredible. So what does he do? Give up?
Not a chance. He goes out into the countryside, rallies support, especially from the poorer classes, the ones perhaps with less to lose and more eager to fight Rome. He builds his own army.
Outside the traditional power structures.
Exactly. Then he marches back, takes Gergovia by force, and then he's hailed as king or chieftain of the Arverni. This is in 52 BC. That's his formal start as a major player.
Okay, so he's overcome that first hurdle, established himself. What's his next move, his big focus?
Unification, straight away. That becomes his absolute priority. He starts making alliances, reaching out to other tribes across Gaul, bringing them together under this one banner, get rid of the Romans.
And the sources say this level of unity, it just hadn't happened before.
Never on this scale. It was unprecedented. And frankly, it wouldn't happen again for decades. It directly countered Caesar's whole strategy.
So because he achieved this, he was given overall command of this united Gallic force.
Yes, unanimously. But leading such a coalition, these tribes had histories of fighting each other. The material points out he had to be really tough. He imposed harsh discipline, Executions weren't uncommon, apparently, and he took hostages from allied tribes to ensure their loyalty.
Wow. That shows just how fragile that unity must have been. He had to force it, in a way.
It seems so. It was a constant balancing act.
Strategically, then, how did he plan to fight the Roman legions head-on?
Mostly no. He knew better than that, usually. He adopted a more defensive strategy. He'd retreat to naturally strong positions like hill forts and focus on harassing Roman supply lines, picking off smaller units. Guerrilla tactics, essentially.
And this led to his most famous, maybe infamous, strategic decision.
Yes. The scorched earth policy. He realized the Romans relied heavily on foraging, on living off the land they conquered.
So deny them that advantage.
Exactly. He ordered the burning of Gallic towns, villages, granaries, crops, everything across huge swaths of territory that lay in Caesar's path. The idea was to starve the legions, make their advance incredibly difficult.
As Caesar marched south from Gergovia, Vercingetorix was literally burning the ground ahead of him.
Precisely. It's a brutal strategy, requiring immense sacrifice from his own people.
And it wasn't always followed, was it? Which led to, well, a major disaster.
Right. The city of Avaricum. It was the capital of the Beechridges tribe, and it was right in Caesar's path. Vercingetorix wanted it burned, like the others.
But the people there objected.
Strongly. They argued their city was really defensible, naturally strong position, good walls. They pleaded not to have their homes destroyed. And maybe against his better judgment, Vercingetorix relented. He agreed they could try and defend it.
So instead of burning it, they hunkered down for a siege.
Yes. Vercingetorix kept his main army nearby, trying to cut off Roman supplies from the outside, while the city held out. But Caesar's legions were, masters of siege warfare.
25 days, the sources say. A long, hard siege.
Brutal. The Romans built ramps, towers, everything. Despite fierce resistance, they eventually broke through the walls.
And the consequences, they were horrific.
Truly awful. The Roman soldiers were furious after the long, hard siege. As revenge, they basically slaughtered everyone inside. The accounts talk about nearly 40,000 people, men, women, children. Only at 800 supposedly escaped.
Just devastating. A terrible, terrible price for not sticking to the scorched earth plan. Did this cripple the revolt?
You'd think it might have. But surprisingly, Vercingetorix managed to rally his forces. He addressed them, acknowledged the loss, but framed it as a result of Roman siegecraft, not Gallic weakness in battle. He spun it, kept morale from collapsing, and actually recruited more warriors, maybe fueled by anger over the massacre.
Incredible resilience. And the next major battle, that was on his home turf, wasn't it? Gergovia.
Gergovia.
Yeah.
And this time, the story was completely different. Caesar tried to take the city, the same one that had initially kicked Vercingetorix out.
The irony.
Right. But Vercingetorix used the terrain, the defenses, perfectly. His warriors crushed the attacking Roman legions and their Gallic allies. They inflicted heavy losses. Caesar was forced to withdraw.
A major victory for the Gauls, a rare defeat for Caesar himself in Gaul. That must have been a huge boost.
Absolutely massive, his prestige soared. But maybe they got a bit overconfident after that.
What happened?
Well, instead of sticking purely to defensive tactics, Vercingetorix seems to have been persuaded, or maybe felt pressured, to engage Caesar more directly. He followed Caesar's retreating armor and fought a large cavalry battle.
And that didn't go so well.
No. The accounts suggest the Gauls took heavy losses, especially their cavalry, which was a key part of their army. This defeat forced Vercingetorix to pull back again, this time retreating to another stronghold, Alesia.
Alesia, September 52 BC. This is it, isn't it? The big one.
This is the decisive moment. The whole war hinges on this. Caesar immediately follows him and lays siege to Alesia. But it's not just a simple siege, it's an incredible feat of Roman engineering and strategy.
He builds fortifications around the city, right?
Yeah.
To keep Vercingetorix trapped inside. A circumvallation.
Exactly. But Vercingetorix had managed to get messengers out before being totally surrounded. He'd called for a massive relief army from all the allied Gallic tribes.
So Caesar knew help was coming for Vercingetorix from the outside.
He knew, and his response was extraordinary. He built a second complete ring of fortifications, this one facing outwards, around his first ring. A contravallation.
Wait, so his own army was sandwiched between the inner wall facing Alesia and the outer wall facing the oncoming relief army.
Precisely. Trapped between two enemy forces. The descriptions call it a donut-shaped fortification. His legions had to be ready to fight attacks from Vercingetorix's men trying to break out and from the huge relief army trying to break in.
That's unbelievable pressure and complexity. What happened when the relief force showed up?
They arrived in huge numbers. The estimates in the sources vary wildly, like 80,000, maybe even up to 250,000 warriors, a massive Gallic host. They launched attacks on Caesar's outer wall.
But Vercingetorix was stuck inside. He couldn't lead them directly.
Right. And that lack of unified command, or maybe coordination, was a problem. The initial attacks weren't successful.
But they nearly broke through at one point.
Yes. There was a critical moment, a combined assault with Vercingetorix attacking outwards from Alesia and the relief force hitting a specific weak point in the outer wall simultaneously. They almost succeeded. The Romans were really stretched thin.
What saved Caesar?
According to Caesar's own account, he personally rode into the thick of the fighting, leading his last reserves to plug the gap. His presence, Roman discipline, and the strength of those fortifications just barely held. The relief army was eventually beaten back and dispersed.
And with the relief force gone, Vercingetorix and his men inside Alesia were doomed.
No hope left. Starving. Trapped. Vercingetorix had to make a decision.
He decided to surrender himself, didn't he, to try and spare his remaining men?
Yes, and how that surrender actually happened. Well, this is where we get those different historical accounts we talked about. It gets a bit fuzzy.
There's the really dramatic version.
All right, Plutarch's version, written much later. He paints this picture of Vercingetorix putting on his finest armor, riding his best horse out of Alesia, circling Caesar's camp or tribunal, then dramatically dismounting, throwing down his weapons, stripping off his armor, and just sitting silently at Caesar's feet.
Very cinematic, like something out of a movie.
Totally. And you can see why later writers, maybe especially French historians looking for a romantic national hero, would latch on to that version.
But Caesar himself tells a different story.
A much more understated one. In his own commentaries, Caesar just says Vercingetorix's envoys came out, the leaders decided Vercingetorix should be handed over, and he was surrendered. No dramatic ride, no silent waiting. Much more matter of fact.
It's a great example of how the victor writes the first draft of history and how later narratives can shape our image of events.
Absolutely. So, regardless of how he surrendered, he gave himself up. What was his fate then?
It wasn't immediate execution, surprisingly.
No. He was taken to Rome and held as a prisoner. For a long time, almost 6 years, the sources say, kept in the Tullianum, which is basically a notorious dungeon.
6 years just waiting in a Roman prison, that's grim. And then
in 46 BC, Caesar finally held his grand triumph in Rome. The massive parade celebrating his victories, especially the conquest of Gaul.
And Vercingetorix was part of the spectacle.
He was the main event in a way. Dragged out of prison, marched through the streets of Rome in chains, displayed as the defeated enemy king. A living trophy.
A terrible public humiliation for a leader who fought so hard.
It was standard Roman practice, but yeah, horrific. And after the parade, his end was ceremonial but brutal. He was taken to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill and ritually strangled.
Strangled. After 6 years in prison, how old was he?
The estimates put him at about 36 or 37. A relatively short life, but one packed with intense struggle.
So that's the end of Vercingetorix, the man. But his story, his legacy, that clearly lived on.
Oh, absolutely. He became this huge figure in France, a folk hero, especially in his home region, the Auvergne. A symbol of resistance, of Gallic identity fighting against invaders.
And you can literally see this legacy today, can't you? In monuments.
Yes, very prominently. Napoleon III, back in 1865, put up that huge 7-meter-tall statue near where they thought Alesia was.
The one with the inscription?
That's the one.
Yeah.
And the inscription is fascinating. It basically paraphrases Caesar, saying, Gaul united, forming a single nation, animated by a common spirit can defy the universe. Using the defeated hero to promote 19th century French nationalism.
Wow. And there were others too. Didn't the sculptor of the Statue of Liberty make one?
He did. Frederick Bartholdi sculpted a statue of Vercingetorix in Clermont-Ferrand. It's amazing to think of that connection. Many statues went up in France during that period.
And his story keeps popping up in culture too, right? Not just statues.
Yeah, the sources mentioned him in Asterix comics, obviously.
Asterix and the chieftain's shield.
Exactly, and other comics too. Then there are films, that French one from 2001, which apparently wasn't very good.
Noted.
An older Italian movie, the HBO series, Rome, had a version of him, even an opera back in 1933. He keeps capturing the imagination.
And maybe the most surprising tribute, an asteroid.
Yep, asteroid 52963, Vercingetorix, named in 2018. His name is literally out there in space now. A lasting tribute across millennia and mediums.
It's quite a story arc. From uniting tribes against Caesar,
implementing scorched earth,
winning at Gergovia,
the epic doomed siege at Alesia,
the conflicting surrender stories,
years in prison, the triumph, the execution.
and then this afterlife as a national symbol, a comic book character, and even an asteroid.
It really highlights how much we know relies on the Roman accounts, though. Primarily Caesar, but also later writers like Dio Cassius and Plutarch. Always worth remembering who wrote the history we read.
Vercingetorix's life was short and ultimately ended in defeat. But what he achieved, that brief, unprecedented unity against Caesar, that was profound.
It's a story of incredible leadership, fierce resistance, but also the harsh reality of facing Rome's military machine. Their strategy, their discipline, their engineering, as the sources really emphasize, they were just dominant in those areas.
From rallying people after being rejected by the elites to that victory at Gergovia and the final stand at Alesia, his story is just packed with drama and strategic points.
And those different versions of his surrender, Plutarch versus Caesar, they're such a good reminder of how historical narratives get shaped, polished, maybe even invented over time, depending on who's telling the story and why.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the power of one person to unite people, even briefly, against impossible odds, and how that struggle gets remembered centuries later, becoming something maybe even bigger than the person themselves.
So maybe something for you to consider is this. How much of the history we take as fact is fundamentally shaped by the perspective of those who won? And what does the enduring, evolving legacy of someone like Vercingetorix tell us about the power of a story, even one that ends in defeat?